Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Drumcore Coffee Shop Podcast. I'm Rob.
I'm George.
And, dude, today I'm super happy that we get to be joined by one of the heroes of at least my youth. I'm pretty sure your youth as well.
Absolutely. I am super excited about today to welcome Kevin Murray to the podcast. Welcome, Kevin.
Yay, Kevin.
Hey, guys. How's it going?
Hold on real quick. Let me try something. Yeah, there we go. Little applause. Okay, so like I was saying, Kevin's a big idol for me, role model, because of where he marched, what he did, all his accomplishments throughout drum corps. Let's get started, Kevin. So tell us a little bit about yourself. Where did you grow up, and how did you get involved with the marching arts?
That's a great question. You know, I haven't gone back to the very beginning in a long time, so that's a great question. So I actually started playing drums in junior high orchestra when I was about 11. So I was literally behind the orchestral snare drum, learning to read music in a somewhat formal setting, and which actually turned out to be a really good thing, because getting a foundation reading music in an actual orchestra turns out is actually a really good thing to do. I started getting into drum set around the same time, and I had no clue about marching band or the marching arts or anything like that until I got into high school. And I guess I was in the 10th grade. Yeah. I met a guy at Cleveland High School in Reseda, California. That's where I went to high school for my first 2 years.
No, I was going to say real quick, that's up, just so people know, that's like in the Hollywood area, correct?
It's in the valley, the San Fernando Valley.
Okay, so north, a little bit north of Los Angeles.
That's actually, like, I live in Encino now. That's just a little bit north of where I live now.
Yeah, it's pretty, right in the heart of the valley. That's what they call it, the San Fernando Valley. They call it the valley. They had songs about it. Frank Zappa did a song called Valley Girl. That's about that valley.
Oh, yeah.
So anyway, I met a guy in 10th grade, and he was actually drumming match grip with some monstrous sized drumsticks, because I had never seen drum corps sized drumsticks, and it turns out they were DC-10s.
Yeah, the Rob Carson version, the old Rob Carson. Yeah,
Rob Carson stuff, and he was doing like very intricate stuff and backsticking. I went up to him and I said, "What are you doing? That's amazing." His name was Steve Leslie, and I've fallen out of touch with the guy. I'll tell you an interesting story about him in a moment, but I got hooked immediately in rudimental style drumming because of its intricacy. Like, just by watching, he was basically emulating some Vanguard kind of, licks and stuff like that. So, sure. I said, how did you learn to do that? He explained he was in the marching band. He was in the drum line. They do a drum corps style kind of thing. Anyway, I was just instantly hooked. So that was in the 10th grade. I joined the band the next year. And that same guy left Cleveland High School to go to Granada Hills High School, which is now a charter school in the area. Mm-hmm. And I felt betrayed, but nonetheless, I was in the drum line in Cleveland in my 11th grade year. And so I was so hooked on it that I actually transferred from Cleveland High School to Granada Hills High School for my senior year of high school.
Just to do drumline?
Showed me, just to be in the drum line, because it was that good.
Oh, okay, cool.
They were like the city champions back then, and we competed in just a mini kind of marching band circuit. But
they're still really good. Granada Hills, they're still really good.
It was amazing. I was there at a time when it was really coming along, and it had a big drum corps influence. I don't know if you guys know the name Tad Carpenter, but
yes.
Tad.
Yes.
Okay, so Tad kind of set up the whole drumline thing there. But when I joined, he left to go teach somewhere else, and he handed the reins to a guy named Scott Newton, who to this day is a very good friend of mine, and he taught the drumline for my senior year, and we won our first drumline competition in the band. We won high drums, and that was like the best thing that ever happened to me. And then I started to become more familiar with drum corps at that point. I started listening to, and just to date myself on how old I am, I listened to the 1982 DCI Top 12 on vinyl.
Yes.
completely wore it out. I mean, 82 Vanguard,
Yep.
82 Blue Devils, 82 Bridgemen, just on repeat constantly.
At the same time, when you're growing up there in the valley, I know like the new wave scene was pretty big around that time too. Were you like into like drum set drumming and that whole thing right there? I hate to say that thing, but that whole vibe.
Well, not only that, I had the best like spiky mullet haircut you've ever seen in your life, man. So I went all in. I was spiky in the front. I was long in the back. I was, playing with bands and we were doing stuff. But honestly, I just started getting pulled into the marching scene more and more because, as you guys know, once you start to kind of unlock the mystique behind it, like how are they doing that? How is that even possible? And how can they play together like that? And I want to be able to do that. Like, to me, it was so much more enticing to be part of a unit playing that well together. So the drum corps thing that I was listening to was, I just could not believe it. So I had to learn more. And that same guy, Steve Leslie, got me into, in 1983, the Hollywood Knights drum and bugle corps.
I remember them.
Okay, yeah, I've heard the name. Now I want to touch back a little bit.
Yeah, sure.
Just so people understand, like the drumming scene in SoCal in the '80s. It's not like today where you had multiple instructors at your high school. Was it just that one person doing everything?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, back then, you were lucky if you had one.
Yeah.
And then to have one that had a drum corps background, you were set, man. I mean, they had to teach all the sections, and maybe you'd have someone volunteer to help there was no pit. I mean, it was just a couple of bell players,
Yep.
Yeah.
Marching xylophone. That's how ancient, I am. But yeah, it was one person, and the more exposed they were to drum corps, the better off you were.
Now, were you like the rest of us? Like for me, I come from a small high school program. I always envied the people with like the 14-inch marching snares because we had big old 15-inch tubs. It sound like you're drumming on a wet diaper. Those 15-inch chrome slinger lens. Was that how it was like for you, or did you guys have like more modern equipment?
What was great so one of the reasons I wanted to move high schools was because of that allure. You had the modern equipment over at Granada. You had the modern instructor. You had the hard parts. And at Cleveland, I literally wore a probably 15-inch red sparkle Ludwig snare on a sling.
Yeah.
I mean, awesome. If you picture that, man, just hucking it up and down. And I was maybe, I think, one of two snare drummers, and we didn't care if we were playing together or not. We were just playing because we didn't know any better.
Yeah.
And then we started watching the drum corps stuff. So we started, trying to make our drum a little flatter and play a little differently. And when I got to Granada, we still had 15-inch drums, but they were on harnesses, first of all. These big, like, acrylic plexiglass harnesses that were not quite what were the Hadleys? Not quite that modern, but they were similar.
Were they like the McCormick harnesses? Maybe that name sounds familiar. Were they like black fiberglass and...
Oh no, this was like a monstrous piece of white fiberglass that covered the entire,
Oh yeah.
But it was still awesome. You picked it up as one piece. You couldn't lift the drum up. You just picked this monster up, and we cranked our drums pretty high comparatively. So we got a good sound. We had 3 snare drummers, and oh my God, 3 guys playing together. We had 2 tri-tom players.
Yeah.
And my buddy Scott Newton, who taught, created out of PVC pipe little Spock drums. So you had trios, 1, 2, 3, and then you had a little 6-inch Spock in the middle. It was unheard of back then. So he was all over it, and it was cool.
Yeah, that's cool. And now on those 15s, you can never crank them like high enough, huh? Or was it like you try to crank them, maybe put a couple extra hoops on them to get that Mylar to sound like higher, like the drum corps sound? Or did you ever do any of that?
We got as close as we could, but they came out with these drum heads back then, and I can't remember the name of them, but it was a Remo head. It had a black dot in the center, but it had a ring, like a pinstripe level ring, but it had a layer of muffling on the inside.
Oh, okay.
And you could crank those pretty high back then, and they were
I was going to say, were they the Power Strokes? The Power Stroke heads?
It was
Primo Power Strokes?
right before the Power Stroke era. And it was what like Vanguard was using, and they sounded killer. And so we could get them, pretty high for the day. But yeah, by no means were they what you hear today.
No, yeah. Okay, so 83, you go to that's when you went to the Hollywood Nights?
Yeah, and I was playing snare drum in high school, but when you get to drum corps, it's pretty sobering. That you get exposed pretty quickly to what you don't know.
Mm-hmm.
So they put me on bass drum, and my buddy Steve was on snare. A couple of my other buddies were on snare, so I was instantly just angry. And what I learned about myself at the time is that there's no greater motivation than to be put on an instrument you don't want to play.
Yeah.
And I played bass drum for a while. The Corps had a very short first tour, and then they folded. So I had the opportunity to really practice and get really good at that point, because I was never going to play bass drum again. That was my goal. It wasn't what I wanted to do. I loved the clarity of the snare drum. I loved the challenge of playing together, and the melodic nature of the bass drum instrument was just not for me. So I practiced really hard, and I essentially had a goal to make the VK snare line.
Okay.
And in 1984, I tried out, and Rob Carson was still there. A guy named Paul Zubrod was there, and a very young Matt Savage was there.
Yeah.
And I tried out, and I barely made it. And I met guys like Dave Hinkle, Steve Smith, who was the center that year, and a few other guys, Chris Carter, Mike Sanders, Rick Deloney. And, these were guys that they knew what they were doing, and I was just trying to hang. And that was another sobering experience, like playing in a real, top 12 quality drum line like that. I think we had 9 snares when I was in the line in 84. And I just, did everything Dave Hinkle did. I mean, he was right next to me. He took me under his wing, hugely influential to me. He was the guy that really showed me that you had to play through the head. You had to be fairly aggressive when you played snare drum, and you had to play super accurately. And I think about the influence that Dave had on me back then, and he was responsible for kind of taking me along that journey to becoming, a high quality snare drummer.
I think a lot of people can say that about Dave in the Southern California area.
Yeah, for sure. I know he had like a big influence with like the Los Altos high school crowd and that whole area of the San Gabriel Valley.
How old were you at this point, Kevin?
So I guess I was 17 years old, because I did 2 years in VK, 17, 18. That was 84 and 85. And then I went to Blue Devils after that. But those 2 years in VK were very important for my development as a snare drummer and a musician, and my career in drum corps.
So in 84, just so people know, like in 83, the Velvet Knights, they were knocking at the door of top 12. They weren't yet top 12. But in 1984, they actually broke through and were able to make the top 12 that year. How was that feeling with the Corps? Was it like the goal at the beginning to make finals? Was like everybody hungry? How was that whole feeling of making finals for the first time with that Corps?
What was amazing was that the veteran part of that Corps was what really put everybody else on their collective backs to get it into the top 12. There was always talk that the Corps was going to be good enough to be in the top 12. And that state of mind is awesome, because if you're always thinking you're on the outside looking in, you're going to stay on the outside looking in. And what I found being a part of that is it was humbling. It was an honor. I had to live up to the expectations of all these veterans that were saying, we're going with or without you. And it's an awesome life lesson, because if you set your goal from the very beginning as to where you want to be, man, you're going to do everything you can to get there. And that Corps did that. I was just glad to be part of it, and I learned a ton that year.
That's cool. So 84, 85, you're in Velvet Knights. 86, you go to Blue Devils. So you go from one extreme of trying to make finals to the other extreme of trying to win finals.
Yeah.
What was that audition experience like there when you got to Blue Devils?
I kind of had a multi-stage audition experience with the Blue Devils, and it was because in 1985, the drum line at VK was playing well. We wound up seventh at the very end in 1985, and that's nothing to be ashamed of. Like we were very good. But throughout the year, the summer, I was kind of being pulled, and I felt like there was more for me. So I started drumming with some of the Blue Devils guys on tour in '85.
Like in the lot?
In the lot, 1985, Denver. That to me, I will never ever forget, because I was walking after retreat, and I bumped into Steve Campbell and Brad Halls, and I can't remember exactly how the conversation went, but we wound up drumming in the parking lot. And the great thing about it was we drew a crowd.
Oh, wow.
And here's the little VK guy hanging with the big boys. That for me was like, that hooked me. And so I knew right there I was going to audition for Blue Devils, because I felt like I was hanging. And so my dad drove me to auditions in Concord in November of '85, coming up to the '86 season. And I'll never forget it. I walked into audition for Float and Scott Johnson. And they didn't give me a snare drum. They had a set of tenors there. And I was like, what's this? And they said, just drum us something. That was Float, just drum. And I just drummed snare drum beats, traditional grip, on the 10-inch number one tom for the quads. And I just, started going, stuff like that. And then Float just said, get out there and drum with the rest of the line. So at that point, you have no idea. Is he just throwing me a bone? Get out there and have fun, and then we'll never see you again, or what? But I came to find out later, Tom Float became a very good friend of mine, and he said, yeah, you were in as soon as you hit it. Yeah. So it was just an awesome feeling. They asked me to come back to the January camp. Back then, you moved in January, and you worked some blue collar job, and then you became a Blue Devil. So from blue collar to Blue Devil pretty quick. And so that was the process of me getting into the Blue Devils.
Now, that audition experience, Blue Devils at that time had just won, was it 3 back-to-back drum championships? And probably could have, there's an argument they probably could have won another one back in 82-ish, but I don't want to make any Bridgman alumni upset, so we won't get into that.
Right.
But so you get there 86. You talked a little bit about you auditioning, but what was the room like? Was it like a competitive environment? Were there like some dudes with egos, guys from other corps showing up to audition? What was that like?
Well, that's always there. It's a very competitive environment. There's a general kind of I'm better than you vibe, which I think is healthy. Competition is healthy. I didn't sense that there was like a destructive competitive vibe, like I was going to make it over you. It seemed like people were generally kind of there to be part of the Blue Devils, which was great. The thing I will never forget is that Steve Campbell was a very imposing presence in that line. He led by brute force, man. You were either going to play or you were dead. It was It was a very imposing thing. And these days things are a lot more inclusive, and we follow more kind of HR style guidelines. Back then it was drum clean or die.
And that was typical of that era. I'm not saying it's bad compared to now, but it's just different. It's different.
How many rookies were in that line? 86.
Oh, it's a good question. I will have to pause for a moment.
Because I'm just wondering, like, how many spots there were when you showed up, like, and did you know that, like, there were only 2 spots or 3 spots?
I want to say about half. And so there was me, there was Matt Falk, there was Rick Rodriguez, there was Brian Wilkie at the time. He's now Brian Hawley. That's 4. I know I'm missing some. Oh, Dave Hart would be 5. We marched 10 that year, so that's 5 and 10.
Yeah.
And so technically Dave DeLulo was a rookie.
Who came over from Vanguard.
So that's 6. And then the veterans, you had Goose, Steve Goslin, you had Steve Campbell, you had Jade Old. That's 3. I know I'm forgetting someone, but I want to say 6 to 7 of that line were rookies that year.
And let me ask you this, because I'm part of the proud VK to Blue Devils pipeline. Was that
nice.
was that a thing when you marched, or were you just like, I'm going to start that? I'm going to start that connection of marching VK and then going to Blue Devils.
Well, you never think of it that way. It's really just about what you want to do personally, not like you're going to set some precedent. There were some people that were doing that. The year after my first year in 1987, we had another guy come up, and you know, you were either going to stay in the VK because it was really the only Southern Cal thing that was viable in the top 12 at the time, or you were going to do freelancers in Sacramento. You were going to do Vanguard or Blue Devil. So really, those were the four choices for you, and it was obviously one corps in Southern Cal and three corps in Northern Cal. So you really had to have your life together to make the trip to the north, and you had to decide which style was going to work out best for you. Blue Devils was almost unachievable to some drummers. They're just like, there's no way I'm ever going to make Blue Devils, so I'm making it up. I'm going to settle for freelancers. And I hate to say it that way, but some guys just would try, or they would never try. And that was the worst part, is that they would never audition.
That still goes on.
Yeah.
That still goes on. Everybody makes like, they sort of handicap their chances. And sometimes it's productive. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes they don't need to be doing that stuff, but that's for everybody to figure out on their own.
Mentally psyching themselves out before it even happens. Okay.
And I even kicked the tires with freelancers. I attended one of their camps. I attended a camp for Vanguard, so, I mean, you just do what works best for you.
So 86, you guys go out there, scorched earth. I think you only lose an evaluation show to Vanguard and then win everything else, correct?
It was the first show of the year. We lost the first show of the year.
Okay.
We couldn't believe it, but it wasn't that we were floored, but I think it was the best thing that happened to that corps was, do not be complacent. And, what I was telling you about VK earlier, we had a very large veteran presence kind of taking everybody on their back. It was the same thing about 86 Blue Devils. And I was a rookie. I just kind of wanted to be there. But I also knew I had to live up to my obligation to, do my very best. And after that first show, man, we were like, it's on. And so we went at it.
A question I've always had, and I jokingly, you guys had the North drums there that year. And I jokingly, we'll say, oh, they marched the flub line. When it's not really a flub line, by all means. But how did that work? Did the guys for the North drums, did they just audition for the North drums, or were they like everybody playing quads, and then if they didn't make like the quads, they got thrown on the North drums, or was it yo man, you can't play, you're not hanging on the snare line, go play North drums?
No, it was, so the drum line was set. We had an idea we were going to do channel 1, and so Scott, I think, just started throwing around the idea of the North drums, and we had people in the pit that had hands. So the whole concept of the quad line and the North line came as a result of, holy crap, we always knew the regular quad line was going to come out in North drums, and then we're going to put them down and bring up the regular modern quads at the time. But the notion that we were going to do the regular line and the North drums in the drum solo, I think became just like, holy crap, we got guys that can do this. And it became this embarrassment of riches type of thing. And then, as you know, it became really kind of cool that you were able to kind of trade between modern and throwbacks.
The other question I had, like 86, and I've always wanted to ask this, the snare vision, the drum solo, the one they feature on the vignette, is that the Spider Vision? Is that the Spider Vision? Who came up with that? I mean, what's the story behind that visual? Because that's like one of the coolest visuals I've ever seen.
I think that DeLulo was probably the guy, because it's a very fast section in 3/4 it's all upbeats, right?
Yeah.
And he was very good at these very regimented, quick Vanguard style moves, and the Blue Devil visuals were typically, the crossover and the, this stuff, and it was a little bit, I wouldn't say looser, but it just wasn't as fast and regimented. So I remember DeLulo having a huge influence on that. And then once you start doing it, people start contributing. but I think he was the originator of that. And then I think the coolest thing to me was not just the one person, but the interplay between every other guy.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that looked super, super awesome. And then you have this, I hate to say it, the symbol line kind of stealing the show up front because they got all their visuals going. And I think I watched the RCC video from that year, and just all the crazy stuff they do. It's like, man, those guys were really good too. So like you said, an embarrassment of riches.
You know, it was all about the guys in the line creating these things. Like the instructor didn't come with a piece of paper that said, here's the visual. They said, figure something out. Yeah. And then if it looked good, they said, it looked great. It's in, right?
Yeah. So 86, now I said that was the last thing, but I guess it's not the last thing. But between you guys and the red team, a.k.a. the Santa Clara Vanguard, was there a real competitive vibe between you guys? Or was it like, hey, let's hang after the show? Or was it like, you know, like tension?
You know, tension is not the right word because drum corps is fun, you know?
Oh, for sure, yeah.
You always want to beat the other corps. There was definitely like they were very motivated to try to take us down. So you could sense that. So when you'd go into the lot and they'd be playing through their show right as we're getting ready to go, or vice versa, there was definitely that, you know, piercing stare you get from any drum line in any lot in the world where they're trying to intimidate everybody that's out in front of them. They definitely were doing that. Ralph was doing his thing, and, you know, they had great parts and stuff like that. And there was definitely a competitive air. It never got like, you've heard the old stories of the East Coast drum lines kind of going at it and stuff like that. Yeah. It never got there, but there was always a sense of, man, we're gonna beat you guys. You know, there was always that, and I loved that.
Okay, so 86. Now we go to 87, and from what I understand, I don't know if I'm wrong or not. I've heard stories that like the 87 line was hands wise better than the 86 line, and that there was some guys from 86 that were having a hard time making the 87 line. Is that any truth to that, or is that just the urban legend?
I think the thing that was really interesting about that line is we were so geeked about winning that you had a bunch of guys returning, and the bar was already very high on the talent side, and so you had other guys trying to make the line that were in world-class lines that just didn't make it because they just couldn't hang. So we definitely pushed one another. One of the motivators for me was that because of my height, I felt like I was a good snare drummer, but they put me on the end in 86 and in 87. Mm-hmm. So in 87, I started to get a little pissed off about it.
Yep. Yeah.
So I felt like I could contribute a little bit more. So again, the motivating factor for a person like me is tell me I can't do something.
Yeah.
Yeah. Kevin, you and I had a conversation about, I don't even know if you remember this, but when you were teaching me, you and I had a conversation about that specifically, about that sense of motivation, and I think it was specifically about how it drove you, you know, for individuals that year.
That's exactly right. I mean, I started working on my individual solo for two reasons. One, I'd never done one. That was the first time I'd ever done a solo. And I felt like I had something to prove. And I guess you could say I wanted to prove it to others, but it was really to myself. And I worked on it a lot in the beginning because if I wasn't going to be counted on to help the line from a leadership perspective, I'm going to do whatever I can to be the best drummer I can, and I can express myself with my solo. And the other thing is that I had just seen Steve Campbell get 100 in individuals in 86.
On his back-to-back.
And you just can't understand how amazing a performer that guy was as far as intensity and the structure of his solo. And you're just sitting there going, there's no way you can ever be that good. Just phenomenal. And I got a ton of inspiration from him. His solo, his style, he used a Scottish snare. I wanted to use a Scottish snare, so I did. And then I got tremendous motivation and influence from Robbie Robinson. I had heard an audio tape of him playing his individual solo. Can you believe that? An audio tape, just a cassette of him playing his solo in, I think, 1980 or 79 or something like that. and I listened to it over and over and over again, and I saw Steve Campbell. And if you listen to my solo back then, you'll definitely see some Steve Campbell in there. But I'm hoping also, and I told Robbie this when I told him how much of an influence he was to me, I hope you hear some Robbie Robinson in there as well, because to me it's no greater, honor than to emulate my heroes and for them to say, wow, that's cool. And Robbie was always just super gracious about that, and I'll never forget it.
Yeah, like I know I&E is a lot different now than what it was then, and just so people know, like in the 80s, and I want to say even into the 90s, like I&E was kind of a pretty big deal.
Yeah.
You would have a lot of people.
Pretty much everybody except for the cadets regularly participated in putting people in I&E back then.
And then you're talking about being on the end of the snare line. I don't know if it's still the same way now, how they set the snare line, but like back then they would, I don't know, Blue Devils, did they try to set it by like the strongest player out, or was it by height, or a combination of both?
Well, George will remember how we tried to do this. It's all about balance, right? I mean, you might have the luck to have a snare line that has that iconic 1982 look where it's this, tall people in the middle, short people out to the end.
Yeah.
But if you've got drummers that aren't as strong in some areas, you want to put them so that there's the appropriate balance and blend. And I don't want to say you're hiding people, but certainly if you've got a very, very strong drummer that can help a weaker drummer, relatively speaking, you got to experiment and do that. George, I don't know if you remember what we tried to do in '94 and stuff like that.
Absolutely. There was a definite logic to where people were in the line, and it wasn't just an analog best to worst kind of thing. Yeah. I think what's interesting is that whole notion of being on the end as a Blue Devil and winning individuals then became a thing. Like in modern day, Keelan, when Brandon won, when Andrew Odello won, I feel like all those guys were on the end or close to the end of the snare line when they won. And I think Scott would be the first one to say that, back then, or like at that point, everybody was good. So it didn't really matter where you stood in the line, and especially because of the way drill was and all of that stuff. But it was almost like, it was rare that the guy in the middle of the line was winning individuals, Like if you were a Blue Devil, it was all about being on the end and getting that notch on your belt.
Yeah. I will say that when I had the responsibility the next year of helping to run the line, I paid much less attention to individuals because there's just so much going on as section leader that you don't want to be selfish and dedicate so much to your individual craft than you want to dedicate to making the line sound great. So you wind up sacrificing your individual goals for the line, and that's the way it should be. If you're given that responsibility, you better make sure the line is great.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So 87 was the last of the Mylar lines, and then from 87 we go to 88 with the Kevlar. But back in 87, I know Vanguard was the first line to use the Kevlar. Did you guys ever get offered Kevlar prototype heads at all to try out from Remo, or was that just Vanguard exclusive?
Yeah, it's funny. I think I don't remember us trying them. We had Yamaha drums that wouldn't have withstood the tension at the time. I think that the sentiment from Float and from everybody else was that those drums didn't sound good. They obviously became really well, good sounding drums, but at the time when we were first comparing them to our sound and what we thought the Blue Devils, needed and represented, we were all just hooked on. We used the Pearl Mylar heads the year before, and then in '87 they had figured out Ludwig had figured out the Striders so that they wouldn't pull out anymore. So we finally got the Mylar heads to a tension that we all liked. And so we were so in love with that, because what you find in the Blue Devils when you get there is you idolize the lines before you. So you kind of want to use what they used. And so we were so, in love with the Ludwig Strider sound, there was no way we were going to use those Kevlar heads. We were so locked in on what it meant to be a Blue Devil using a silver dot.
Well, what was cool like about the Mylar era is, I mean, you listen to the recordings and you listen to a recording without knowing who it was, but you would know who it was by like tuning and by the playing. Like Bridgman, to me, like the Bridgman always sound like their drums are just finger tight and that East Coast slurred to the bone. I don't know if that makes any sense at all.
I mean, and especially like, I think I want to say the 80s were really dominated by this sense of having a really strong audio identity, if that makes sense. So every group had a certain type of music that they were known for, a certain way that they structured their shows, and a certain sound, you know, and everybody was feeding off of that. Because everybody was consuming drum corps primarily audio back then.
Totally. And that's such a great point, because I can tell you, you know, a 27 Lancer snare line, I can tell the difference between them and the Bridgman and the Madison Scouts, and the Cavaliers, you know, and the Cadets. You know, I knew what those. I used to just totally clown on the tuning of the Cadets back in the mid 80s. I'm like, those snare drums, come on, you know. And, you know, shame on me, they wound up beating our ass. But I could tell apart all of the, you know, snare tuning and even the tom tuning. Like Vanguard had this great kind of bottom end to their tom sound, especially. It got more into the 90s for them. But, man, I agree, George. It's just the audio identity is such a... I think that's what made it super fun, too. And you could choose which corps you wanted to be in based on that identity.
And it's interesting that you bring up Cadets, because like when you got to Blue Devils, there was like you were joining something that was, you know, really strong and very established. But the late 80s marked a time of a little bit of change, you know? So, I mean, the 87 Blue Devils drumline was amazing. But here comes the Cadets line. Yeah. And then in 88, you guys switched to a different sounding head, which definitely changed your audio identity a little bit, and it was something to. So there were these little bits of the activity moving forward, you know, and you guys trying to stay at the top of that and figure out how to move forward with everybody else. What was that like? The idea that Cadets got a perfect score in drums before you guys even stepped on the field that year. Those are the kinds of things that people remember about 87. So, but that's from the outside. From the inside, what was going on? And were you guys even processing or aware of those kinds of things from inside the line?
I think you know, the attitude of the line in 87 was we wanted to be like the 1983 snare line. So you look like, what's your model? Like, what are you trying to do? So they were super clean. So our goal was play hard stuff really clean and let the programming take care of itself. It's out of our hands. So we did the best we could there. And, you know, as I became an instructor later, I learned a very valuable lesson from the 87 experience that is about understanding what is on the sheet. And are you playing to the sheet, or are you playing to your own ideal or picture of what you want to do? And I've made some good friends, you know, with you know, the Vanguard alumni and the Cadets alumni from back then, and they learned how to max out the sheet, and they did it brilliantly. I mean, if you think about it, they fully understood that the judging system at the time was about building and accruing credit based on achievement. And that could be execution, it could be ensemble, it could be GE, it could be demand. They figured out a way to max out the sheet, and therefore they were rewarded for it. And to me, it's like they did it, and they built that cred with 3 judges at the same time. So you're damn right, that was great, right? And for the drummers in the world, though, they're like, wait a minute, doesn't that mean that they were perfect, that they were flawless, that they didn't make any mistakes? Nope, it doesn't. It means they understood what the judging criteria were, and they played to it, and they performed. So when I discovered that, it was like, you better know what's on that sheet before you build your program and you build your repertoire or whatever, because those guys were smart and they figured it out and they got rewarded for it. So I have the utmost respect for the fact that the staff understood that and the members bought into that as well.